Welcome back. The next chapter that we're going to talk about, which was in relation to the friendships one that we just finished, is to talk about dating and romantic relationships and love and how do adolescents learn to form these types of relationships with other people. So, the different topics in this chapter, we're going to be talking about what used to be called dating. We'll talk a little bit about terminology now. And we will talk about love. What is teenage like love? What is teenage love like for adolescents? We'll talk about breakups. We will also spend a little bit of time talking about adolescent marriage, which is a topic that you've probably not even considered too much, and that will encompass this chapter. So we start off here with a few pictures of different kinds of teen romantic relationships, and we'll then move on and talk about some dating. So this wonderful picture here, I don't know these people. I just pulled them from online, but it's a great picture of what dating was like. I'm guessing that was maybe in the 60s, maybe in the 50s, something like that. But dating was very formalized then. Generally, a boy asked a girl to go to a dance or a party. He made the arrangements, he paid, he came and picked her up. It was just that really formal process that we know doesn't happen anymore. And really, teenage dating is pretty hard to study because it's hard to define what that is in the present day. It's no longer the formal procedure that it used to be. So today, dating is much more informal. Oftentimes, kids won't even use the word dating. They will use things like, and you all are familiar with this, talking. And then I'm not really even sure. I did a search and I'm not really even sure what seeing somebody. A lot of it has to do with status updates on social media, and there's all kinds of different status updates for relationships on social media, if you've taken a look at that before. And in addition to being less formal, kids today are more likely to go out in groups to movies, to games, to other kinds of places where kids hang out. So group kinds of situations are more common, at least until kids start to get older. So when we ask adolescents, what is a date? What does that mean? Oftentimes they'll still list traditional activities, going to a movie, going out to dinner, going to a party. And you should know that dating is really a very American tradition. For example, in Europe, teens generally go out in groups until they're really up into college. Dating one-on-one as pairs just is a much more rare thing. It's much more common here in the United States. So let's take a look at some of the developmental patterns that we see in adolescent dating. American teens today date earlier than in previous generations, clearly. Now, on average, girls start dating around 13 and boys around 14. But obviously, kids start much younger than that. Many start much younger than that. They'll talk about having a boyfriend or a girlfriend when they're 10 or 9. And then some kids start much later than that. So by senior year, most adolescents reported that they have dated at least a little bit, and researchers have discovered that there's this dating behavior sequence. You know, researchers, they have to absolutely quantify everything, and so they've discovered this interesting sequence. Now, this has to do with, as kids get older, how does the kind of dating they do change? So, for example, for very young teens, and we're talking really middle school kids between 10 and 12, they basically go to some place where their romantic interests are present. So kids will go to, they hang out at the fast food place or at the football games or wherever, and they'll just kind of watch each other. They may not interact with romantic interests much because there's still just a lot of self-consciousness going on. And then between 12 and 14, so late middle school, early high school, they start to go more to social gatherings arranged by adults. So things like dances, church youth activities, that kind of thing. And then kids start to date in more mixed gender groups around 14 to 16. So this is when we'll see groups of kids going out together, not necessarily pairs at this point. And then couples begin to date in pairs, usually once they have a little bit more mobility and they don't have to have their parents drive them, 16 to 18 or so. And you might be thinking, oh, I think the ages are much younger than that. And there's a lot of truth to that. Many kids do this younger, but the research still tends to hold that those are around the ages that we see. Now, when kids do start dating and seeking out romantic attraction, romantic partners, the things that they look for, this is always kind of interesting in the qualities that they seek in a romantic partner. So, in middle adolescence, the main thing that boys are looking for is attractiveness. Sexual orientation doesn't matter. Boys are looking for somebody to date. They're looking for somebody that they're attracted to. For girls, they're more interested in the emotional intimacy, the support, somebody who's going to be loyal to you, somebody who you can really talk to. And then by later on in adolescence, that tends to take a shift. Everybody's still interested in physical attraction, obviously, but it tends to be more interpersonal. So both boys and girls list those interpersonal qualities, loyalty, and somebody you can trust and somebody you can talk to. We know that even though certainly things have changed in terms of gender roles, many kids still hold to more traditional sex roles in dating. These are called dating scripts. So what we see here are things like girls are more likely to take on a reactive dating script. So that means they respond to someone asking them out. They are less likely to initiate, although we know certainly girls do initiate. And boys are more likely to make the first move, initiate the date, the pay, all that kind of stuff just really depends, but provide transport, that sort of thing. So that we know that those traditional dating scripts are still very much alive and well. Now, we know that dating is generally associated with positive development as long as it's not really early on. Dating regularly can be associated with popularity, positive self-image, so generally good things for both boys and girls. Now for girls, mixed gender activities tend to be good things, but early serious dating can lead to problems. So for example, parents who allow their 10 or 11-year-old daughter to have their romantic interest over for dinner a lot and, allow them to do a fair amount of one-on-one time. Those can lead to things like depression, anxiety, and certainly early serious dating can be associated with a risk of pregnancy and also substance use and abuse that can go along with the early dating. Now, what about, okay, I'm going to come back to this that cartoon here. So what about romantic relationships in GLBTQ teens? So the feelings, it sometimes can be more complicated for kids if they realize that they have feelings for same sex or different, same gender, different gender, but a lot of the feelings very much the same. So the research finds that females begin to act on same-sex attraction a little bit later than males, between 14 and 18, and then males between 13 and 15 or so. So that usually represents the first romantic sexual interaction with someone that they're attracted to. They find that for girls, it is pretty common to date boys first. Because they're kind of responding to a social script that's what girls should do. For boys, it's boys who are gay, it is less common to date girls first. So they find that seems to be the case. And then just like with kids who are heterosexual, sexual experiences don't necessarily equal dating relationships. Certainly they can be intertwined, but they don't have to be. So for kids of any sexual orientation, they may have sexual experiences that they don't define as dating. Now let's talk about these relationships in a little bit more depth. People have questioned for a long time, for generations, whether adolescents can really experience true love. Is it just infatuation? Is it just physical attraction? Can they really experience real love? And oftentimes the result of dating is love. So let's take a look at really the most famous theory that we have in psychology about love and see how it applies to adolescence. So I'm just going to put this picture up here, which does a good job of describing this. So I just want to describe different parts of this. This most famous theory of love is Robert Sternberg's theory. This is true no matter how old people are. So this is a theory that goes across different ages. And he combines different types of love into qualities of love. So the three main types of love are liking, commitment, and infatuation over here. Those are the three different types of love. Intimacy, which is emotional intimacy, commitment, and then passion, which is the physical aspect of love. And when you combine those three, you get different kinds of love that can be experienced by people of different ages. So let me describe each of these first, okay? So let's start with the infatuation, the passion alone. Infatuation, of course, is the physical attraction. That's the sexual desire that people feel. The intimacy is the feeling close, the emotional attachment that people have to each other. And then the commitment is the pledge, the loyalty, the pledge to love in the long run, which of course for adolescents that could be a month. For other people it could be a longer period of time. So taking those three, let's combine them to look at the different kinds of love teens can experience. Let's start back up at the top here. So if you have a relationship with someone that's based on emotional intimacy and closeness, that's a friendship. That's a liking relationship. If you have a relation with someone that is based on commitment but doesn't have emotional or physical intimacy, that's what's called empty love. So that's making a commitment, but it's really pretty hollow. And then infatuation, if you have a relationship with someone that's based on the physical attraction alone, without the emotional intimacy and without the commitment, that's what we call infatuation. When you combine intimacy and commitment, you get companionate love. So the way to think about this is often couples that have been together for a long period of time. The fire is gone down a little bit. You don't have that crazy wild in love feeling, but you're very close emotionally, and you've certainly made a commitment to each other, and that's what we consider to be companionate love, which is a wonderful kind of love. Then if you have a relationship that is characterized by physical intimacy and emotional intimacy, that's our typical definition of romantic love. So when people get married and when people talk about being in love, that's usually what they're talking about. They feel both physically attracted to their partner and also emotionally close to them. And then if you have infatuation and the commitment, you've got what's called fatuous love. So these are people who have a lot of passion, but maybe lacking the emotional intimacy. And a lot of reasons a lot of the time, it's because the relationship has proceeded pretty fast. So if you think about people who get together and they make a commitment, I'm thinking of those silly Bachelor kinds of shows. They don't know each other enough to have that strong emotional intimacy, but sometimes that physical intimacy is so strong, people mistake it for that emotional intimacy. So how does this theory apply for adolescents? Let's take a look at that. In most adolescent relationships, it's this commitment piece that is missing, or it's tentative, or it's weak. Most teenage relationships last a few weeks, maybe a few months. This does not mean that adolescents are incapable of commitment, but since most people don't marry now, as we'll see, until their late 20s, most people aren't seeking a permanent relationship yet. Of course it can happen, but most of the time it doesn't. So the two main types of adolescent love are, and you can probably guess this, infatuation and romantic love. So let me go back. So the infatuation, passion alone, and then romantic love, emotional intimacy, and then the physical intimacy. And as I mentioned, the feelings of passion are so strong that it may be mistaken as this consummate love. I didn't mention this. When you have all three elements, this is the type of love that people talk about dreaming of. When they're really looking for someone in their lives, that's really what they're looking for. And so this passion can be so strong, it can be mistaken for all three of these things. We know that teenagers can experience consummate love, but most adolescent relationships don't progress to that point because things happen and people grow apart and they get older, and that's kind of the process of things. So what is the process by which adolescents choose someone to date and then subsequently to oftentimes fall in love with? Well, the answer to that is really much the same as they do with their friends. It's similarity and the process of consensual validation. So consensual validation is when we choose people as friends similar to ourselves because we want to feel good about ourselves. So when we choose partners who agree with us, who are similar to us, who like the same things, who have very much the same values and beliefs, that makes us feel good about ourselves, or we like to find a consensus in others. So most of the time, people choose partners similar in intelligence, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, religion, oftentimes physical attractiveness, values, beliefs. So a partner who shares your religious beliefs supports your view and you feel good about that. So essentially we tend to choose people similar to ourselves to fall in love with. And there is also some evidence that after the initial attraction, the way we develop our relationships has a lot to do with our parenting, how we dealt with our parents and the attachment we had to our parents. So people who had a secure attachment to their parents are perhaps more likely to form secure romantic attachments. They're more likely to be supportive of their partners. People who had anxious attachment to their parents oftentimes will display some dependence qualities. Now, in no way is this positive, formative. It's not 100%, but there are trends. And then people who had avoidant relationships with their parents are more likely to form kind of more distant, standoffish relationships with their romantic partners. So people love and form attachments to their partners similar to they did as their parents. Now, there haven't been too many people that have looked at really the differences between romantic love for adults and romantic love for teenagers, but there's a researcher named Brown who did, and he came up with this model of adolescent love, which looks at how our love relationships change as we get older. And a lot of it recognizes the importance of our friends' influence on our relationships. So, for example, in the initiation phase, this is the way relationships oftentimes are in early adolescence. They're kind of superficial. They're based mostly on physical attractiveness. There's many times a lot of anxiety around them. Do they like me? Do my friends like them? And fear, because kids are really afraid of being ridiculed by their friends. I remember back in, late elementary school, middle school, you really didn't want people to find out who you were attracted to or had a crush on because you were afraid they would make fun of you. So that's an example of that. Then there is the status phase, and this is kids' real first romantic relationship. They remain aware of their friends' evaluations and are worried about how their status with their friends will change. So are my friends still going to like me? Are they going to think differently of me? Kids usually date within their crowd, but oftentimes lower status kids may fantasize about dating someone of a higher status. And I have up here messengers because friends can serve as messengers to protect their status. So if you have someone that you have your eye on, kids may sometimes have their friends sort of feel it out and see if they feel the same. And then if they do, then maybe it's safe to make a gesture or to let it be known. So your friends are kind of the go-betweens. When I was in school, I know it's not like this anymore, but when I was in school, we did it by passing notes. I remember so clearly your friend would pass your crush a note and it would say on there, "Do you like so-and-so? Check the box, yes or no." Oh gosh, just awful, awful times. In the affection stage, this is when kids are getting a little bit older, there are deeper levels of intimacy possible, and relationships may last a few months versus just weeks or days. So you feel closer, the emotions are stronger for the other person. Peer influence starts to decline somewhat, and your status concerns decline. So you're not quite as concerned anymore with what people are going to think about the person that you're with. But friends do become arbitrators, go-betweens. They become private eyes. So if you all know what I mean by that, your friends are going to be the one who say, "Oh, I saw them talking to so-and-so." Letting you know if there's a transgression or maybe a betrayal, and then you may relay messages back and forth between your friends. So your friends still play a role, and your friends, of course, provide support for you. And then finally, in the bonding phase, this is for later adolescence, these are more serious relationships, and your friend's role really recedes. Their opinions are much less critical than they used to be as kids are older. So I think this cartoon's kind of funny. They're there and they're on their phones. And then he says, "The time we spend together is so precious." This is modern romance. Okay, I have another cartoon here. The way I see it, there are three levels of intimacy in a relationship. There's friendship, there's steady dating, and there's Rich and Amy, one word. That's not intimacy, it's osmosis. Just think of all the money we've been wasting by buying separate clothes. So in this Sitz cartoon, which is about teenagers, there's this kind of funny couple there. And I know a real life Rich and Amy. It's kind of funny, but they are never apart. Okay, well, unfortunately, the one side of teenage relationships that happens a little too often is breaking up. Now, I do want to mention in this particular section, I am going to talk about dating abuse. So this is just a warning that some people might be a little bit sensitive to that, or maybe a lot sensitive to that. This lecture will be posted in the unrecorded section of our Blackboard site. So if you want to skip this part of my commentary and just read about it, then you're certainly welcome to do so. But, okay, so for breaking up, for adolescents, their egocentrism can really increase the intensity of their unhappiness after a breakup. No one has ever felt the pain they felt. They think that no one has loved like they have. They will never find anybody to be with them again. Their parents certainly don't understand, and even their friends can't understand the intensity of their emotions. So the personal fable, they believe their suffering is beyond what anyone has ever experienced. And of course, we understand as adults that breakups hurt. I mean, that we many people know what that feels like. We all go through very much the same thing. So a teenager's pain is probably not a whole lot different than what a lot of people experience. But that personal fable just makes them feel very alone and sometimes isolated. The reason that adolescents break up, relationships break up, there's numerous ones. Boredom, um, you just go in separate directions, have different interests, different friends, different activities, and then conflict of beliefs and goals. So you just may not be compatible in that way. And the research finds that couples who break up, this is probably no surprise, but they tend to be lower beforehand on levels of love and intimacy. So they weren't as close anyway. They had fewer things in common, and they were less balanced in terms of commitment and power. So commitment and power is a really important thing. If one person likes the other more than the other does, that creates a power imbalance. And the person who likes more is in a down position versus the other person. And so that imbalance can lead to boredom on the part of the person who likes less, and it can lead to sometimes clinginess on the person who tends to like more. So those are some of the things that are involved in adolescent breakups. They find that more often, and these are for heterosexual relationships, obviously this wouldn't work for other genders, but girls are more likely to be the dumper, and boys are more likely to be, of course, the dumpy. And so after relationships break up, boys tend to be unhappier. This is after heterosexual relationships. Girls are more likely to end the relationship, and then boys are unhappier and more depressed and find it harder to accept the end. So about half of those who have been broken up with, report at least a moderate level of depression involved, because obviously it's an unhappy occurrence, and for at least one person, it's not wanted. What are the problems that we sometimes see after teen relationships break up? And certainly this is true of adult relationships also, but is called romantic harassment. And this occurs when there is either psychological or physical abuse in an attempt to keep dating someone. It can be perpetuated by either boys or girls. This can be for any type of gender mix in a relationship. It is more common for boys to behave in this way than it is for girls. So most harassers are males, but certainly females can also harass. So you can probably think of some examples of romantic harassment, things like late night phone calls, constant phone calls, repeated texts, watching the other person, following them, having somebody watch them, sending them repeated emails or letters, and then, of course, insults, threats. So most harassers report merely trying to break through the other's resistance. So it's like, if they knew how much I love them and how hurt I am without them, then they would agree to be with me. If only they knew how much I love them. But the behavior goes overboard and ends up being harassing and abusive to the person. And so in the worst case scenario, it does become abusive. I want to talk about this for just another minute. This was from a movie a number of years ago, Swim Fan, about this. There's been a number of teenage movies on this issue. This is incorrect. This should be 2016. Some information, recent information we have about abusive dating relationships. Teens report that 1 in 5 who date, now this isn't 1 in 5 teens, 1 in 5 teens who have dated someone report that they have been physically struck by their partner. So these are usually females we're talking about here. And 1 in 3 who have dated report that they have been subjected to emotional abuse by their partner. And that would be things like threatening, all the things we talked about, threatening. Sometimes people will threaten self-harm. I'll kill myself if you break up with me. All those are examples of emotional abuse. And unfortunately, teenagers are more likely to stay in these kind of relationships than adults are, because largely if they're inexperienced, especially if this is their first relationship, they don't really know what healthy is. And some teens would rather have a bad relationship than none at all. So there are all kinds of programs and PSAs out there to try and raise awareness of abusive relationships for teens. So this is something to really watch out for if you're a coach or a teacher or a school counselor. This is the kind of thing you're going to see. We could talk all day about this subject, but I just wanted to give you a few highlights and make you aware of a few things. Here's a video clip that I will link in the information section of this video that talks about just the issue with abusive relationships for teens. So please take a look at that if you're so willing. Okay, so let's move on to our last 2 topics here, and that is cohabitation and marriage for teens. So cohabitation, we're going to trend into the emerging adulthood kind of age here. So the research finds that 2/3 of individuals have lived with a romantic partner by the time they're in their mid-20s, 26 and 27. And that makes sense, is because, as we will learn here, most people don't get married. The average person doesn't get married until their late teens or late 20s anymore. So the average age of first cohabitation tends to be 22 for male, 20 for female. Again, this is across gender and sexualities. It doesn't matter. The gender of their partner doesn't matter. We're just talking about being with a romantic partner. And then 2/3 of these individuals will marry within a 3-year period. So oftentimes people will cohabitate as a way to test for marriage, in place of marriage, as a matter of convenience prior to marriage. Usually there's pretty practical reasons that people will list for living together. Now, it is true that living with your partner before marriage is related to higher likelihood of divorce, but there's a couple things about this. I'd like to talk about this a little bit more, because you'll hear people saying anecdotally, I lived with my partner and we've been married for 20 years, and so it didn't have any effect on us. But in general, the research does find that there's a trend for people who cohabit before marriage to be more likely to divorce. But we also know some other things about people who cohabit before marriage and divorce. They are less religious, so there may be fewer religious constraints on staying married. They tend to be more accepting of the idea of divorce anyway, and then they may be somewhat more skeptical to marriage. So they may live together just to see if, do we really want to get married? Do we really want to do this kind of thing? But then there is another really interesting theory that came out a while here ago, 2005, so about 15 years ago or so, by a researcher named Scott Stanley. And I heard him talk at a conference, and he has this really interesting theory of what he calls inertia. He looked at the factors that underlie why people who live together are more likely to get divorced. And he calls this his sliding versus deciding theory. So here's what this is about. There is no research that shows cohabiting leads to better marriages. People think that it will because they think they're going to go into marriage with their eyes wider open than before. And they know that males especially tend to be less dedicated to a marriage than females after living together. That's generalities. And he calls this inertia. People who get engaged, who make a commitment to each other before living together, are not in as great a danger of problems because they make a commitment before living together. So either you get engaged before you live together or you get married before you live together. You are deciding to make a commitment and then you live together. But many people who cohabit before making a commitment marry because of the constraints on the relationship. Once you're living together, it's harder to break up because then you have to separate your household and your lives, and you've already intertwined them pretty tightly. But these are people who wouldn't necessarily have decided to get married in the first place. So what happens is that people live together, and then it's, maybe they're not sure whether they want to get married and they're mixed feelings about it. Well, let's just go ahead and get married. We're already living together. So that's what's called sliding into marriage. So his theory is that these people who do that are already less committed before marriage and then maybe more likely to divorce. So deciding to make a commitment before living together is associated with less risk versus the sliding. So hopefully that makes sense. You can read about that. Look up Scott Stanley and this deciding versus sliding. It's a whole kind of interesting line of research. Okay, so speaking about marriage, let's talk a little bit about adolescent marriage, which might be something that you've not thought much about because it just doesn't happen quite as often anymore. So we'll start by looking at some statistics on incident, and these were just from last year. The median age in this country of first marriage is 28 for female and 29 for male. And they use the median instead of the mean because there are certainly outliers. There are people who don't get married for the first time until their 50s, and then some people who get married. So it tends to, young, so it tends to skew older. So that's why the median is oftentimes used. A little more statistics here on the next page. So these show the percentages of people of a particular age who are married, number of people married per thousand. So from 15 to 17, 4.6 people out of every thousand. So that's like 0.005% of younger teenagers are married. Older teenagers between 18 and 19, that's about 0.02% of kids that age are married. And then emerging adults, the young 20s, about 11% are married. And they know that more girls than boys get married younger. So that's the percent who are female. So of all the 15 to 17-year-olds who are married, just over half are females. About 2/3 of the 18 and 19-year-olds are females, and just under 2/3 for the low 20s are married. And then we also find some statistics. This is really interesting to me by state. This looks at the age people first get married. I assume these are means. I couldn't really tell, but when you look at Ohio, so we've got women 27.1, men 29.2, so right about in line with the national average. And then I was trying to see if there are any kind of outliers. So up here, okay, is this New Jersey? I don't even know. 31 and 29. So up here is older for men, 32.3. Up here in the Northeast, 28.3. I would expect to see maybe some younger ages in the South. Here we go, 26. That's a little bit younger. For 25 for females. Those look like the youngest ones. Out here, 24. Okay, that's Nevada, correct? I don't even know. That's kind of embarrassing, but we've got some outliers here. But generally up in the Northeast, they tend to be older, and then kind of in the South, they tend to be a little bit younger. Just an interesting little map here. Okay, let's take a look at the outlook for teenage marriages. Unfortunately, it's generally not great. I hate to dash the happily ever after, but generally, teenage marriages are unhappy and they don't last. And there is a positive correlation between age and success up to a point. I'm going to talk about that here in just a minute. Here are some reasons why they are generally unhappy, and some of the things that are oftentimes involved in a teenage marriage. They usually involve low socioeconomic status teens. We do know that. So they are less interested in college. So here's the characteristics of teenage marriages. One of the reasons they often involve low socioeconomic status teens is that those kids are many times less interested in college. So marriage is many times the best option, especially for girls. There are higher rates of premarital pregnancy in lower socioeconomic status adolescents, and they are more likely to have lower grades and intelligence level. And again, college or further education might not be so much of an option for them. Other characteristics of kids who choose to marry when they're teenagers, they are more likely to live in rural parts of the country, in the southern U.S., as we just saw. They may have lower levels of emotional adjustment, and so may be using marriage to compensate for that. And they also may have a less satisfactory relationship with parents, so they may see it as kind of the best option to get out of their home. Okay, here's the chart that I was referring to here. So up to a point, there's a correlation between the average age of marriage and how long the marriage would last. So if we look here in this first column of all ages, so these are the percent that where the probability of the marriage breaks up. So about a 48% probability for people who get married under the age of 18. It drops to about 40 if you get married in your late teens, 29% if you get married between 20 and 24, and then over 25. And 25 is about the cutoff there. People who wait till the age of 25, generally about the same. And then we do see some racial differences here that you can see. And African Americans tend to have the higher rates of divorce in this country. So there is a relationship to a point between age and the likelihood of breakup, as we would expect. So the typical teen marriage, we know, usually involves a high school girl or a girl who's high school age and an older boy, a post-high school boy. And there's an average of 4 to 6 years difference between, and obviously we're talking about heterosexual marriages here, between the boy and the girl. And many times, the younger the bride, the larger the age difference. So I think, depending on the state, many states you can get married, I want to say at 14 when you have parental permission. Other states may be different. But a 14-year-old is more likely to marry like a 25-year-old versus a 17-year-old is more likely to marry maybe a 19 or a 20-year-old. So the younger the bride, many times the larger the age difference. So why does this happen? Why do teenagers marry early? There's a number of reasons here. Obviously, pregnancy is one of the biggest ones. And the younger the marriage, the higher the likelihood there is to be a pregnancy. We know that as well. Earlier, faster dating experience. So kids who are allowed to go steady, whatever they call it, seriously date someone in the 7th grade, they're more likely to marry younger than someone who is not allowed to date seriously until later. There is the whole personal fable issue. You know, teenagers have a fairy tale, romanticized view of marriage. We're in love and we're going to get married and everything's going to be great. It is hard. Marriage is hard even under the best of circumstances. And some people, some kids, especially girls, view it as their main goal in life. Especially girls who view marriage as their main goal in life are especially likely to marry early. And then some kids want to marry early to get away from school problems or problems with parents at home. Now, the last thing we'll talk about here are some of the special problems. Why do these marriages end typically early and unhappily? There are a couple of reasons why. Problems arise from being young, immature, not having enough experience to make good choices. So the first one comes from your choice of spouse. The person that is right for you when you're 15 or 16, the chances are pretty good that they may not be suitable for you when you're 25 or 30. You are still growing up, you're still changing. If you think, for many of you probably, if you think back to the people that you had crushes on when you were younger or you dated when you were younger, it's hard to even imagine being with some of those people now. And maybe some of you are with those people now, and that's great. But in general, the research finds that is more unusual. We know that teenagers have poor problem solving skills. They're more likely to be selfish, to not be able to compromise, to walk out when there's problems. As we've talked about, that prefrontal cortex, if you get married when you're 15, you've got a good 10 years to go before your brain's developed. You're not going to be having the level of thinking and problem solving as an adult. And then, of course, if you add a pregnancy there, parenthood is for an older, established people. Parenting is hard. So for someone who's young and inexperienced and doesn't have coping skills, it's just an incredible amount. It's just an overload, and there are typically money problems involved, which is very stressful. And then the social isolation, of course, that comes from marrying young, the lack of freedom to be young. You're have to be home with your spouse or home with your child, and other kids your age are out having fun, and that really poses an awful lot of difficulties. So this picture here is of Macaulay Culkin, and he got married really young. I assume he's not with this girl anymore. I don't follow him, but I just put him up here as an example. So I hate to paint a negative picture of happily ever after, but unfortunately that's oftentimes the case for teenage marriages. But aside from that, there are positive things to say about teenagers and romance and love, and it's a big growing experience for them. There are all kinds of developmental things they can learn, and hopefully you glean that from this particular lecture.